So these are not necessarily the final results, but very close to it. As you can see, the SPD led the CDU by a whisker. The Greens, having been within striking distance of winning the campaign, fell back to around 15%, but nonetheless came in at a record high. The FDP are in a position to also form part of the next governing coalition, and the AfD and the Die Linke, the two more extremist parties on the right and left, scored well in East Germany, but have sunk back below previous highs, and Die Linke only managed to get into the German Bundestag because they won 3 direct mandates, which exempts them from the 5% hurdle. And if we just have a quick look at what that means for potential coalition combinations, one possibility would be a continuation of the current grand coalition between the SPD and the Union, which is the combination of the Christian Democrats and the Christian Socialists. There is not quite enough seats for the left-wing possibility of a coalition between the Social Democrats, Die Linke and the Greens, but there are 2 possible combinations which include both the Greens and the FDP, one with the SPD, which is called the Traffic Light Coalition because for obvious reasons it's red, yellow and green, and one with the Union called the Jamaica Coalition because it has the colours of the Union, of the Jamaica flag. So let me, with that, jump into the questioning. Just in terms of quick housekeeping, we'll be running this part of the conversation for around 40 minutes, and then Antonia will be opening up to a session moderating questions from you, the audience. So if you have questions at any time while we're speaking, please do feed them in through the Q&A function, or like other people's questions, and we'll try to get through as many of those questions as we can. Let me start with a question to you, Tom. This was the first campaign since 1949 in which there wasn't an incumbent chancellor standing. How far do you think the absence of an incumbent, and in particular the absence of Angela Merkel, affected the campaign?
To an absolutely huge extent, frankly. As you say, this is the first time that modern Germany has had a campaign without a sitting chancellor. And it was clear to parties, it was clear to voters that there was a huge void to be filled. And I think that's one reason why we had a campaign that was rather empty in sort of programmatic, thematic terms. It wasn't really about anything. It was very focused on the personalities of the various candidates to replace Angela Merkel in the Chancellery. And I think one of the things that Angela Merkel was able to do so successfully was to tap into the broad centre of the German electorate, to extend the reach of her Conservative Party to places that it hadn't previously been able to tap. She won pretty substantial majorities, at least for most of her election wins. And I think all of the different candidates, the leading candidates to replace her, tried to tap into that sort of Merkel middle in various different ways, in sort of interestingly different ways. And some of them, frankly, did a better job of it than others. None of them did an absolutely brilliant job of doing that. But one thing I take away from this election, which is quite interesting, is that on the one hand, we see, like you see in many European countries, a fragmentation of the vote. The 2 big Volkspartei and the People's Party, the Social Democrats and the Christian Democratic bloc, between them got about half of the vote, and that number has been declining over decades now, and we will have to have almost certainly a 3-party coalition, which will be complicated in the months ahead. On the other hand, that fragmentation did not come at the expense of the center of German politics conceived more broadly, if you think of parties like the Liberal Free Democrats or the Greens. So the extremist parties, as you mentioned in your introduction, Die Linke and the AfD, Die Linke particularly did badly. The AfD didn't do particularly well, although it does have some regional strongholds in the east. So the extremes of German politics have been weakened. The center has been strengthened, but at the same time, you have fragmentation. So it's a complicated situation. But I think from the perspective or in the context of European politics, the fact that the center is not only held, but actually strengthened is a reassuring thing to take away from this result.
Thank you. Constanze, let me just pick up on one of the points Tom made as a way of bringing you into the conversation. As Tom mentioned, this was a campaign very much focused on personalities. We had an unprecedented, I think, 7 triels with the 3 chancellor candidates of the 3 parties. And there was also an unprecedented amount of negative campaigning with some controversial advertising both by the SPD and by the Union. To what extent do you feel that German politics is being Americanized in the sense of German election campaigns becoming closer to the way in which politics is waged in the States?
I was just asked that at an internal meeting at Brookings, and I think my answer to that is not very much. In some ways, I think we're really hewing to the norm of European fragmentation, in that many voters, make up their minds at the last minute. In this case, I think 1/3 of voters said in polls that was what they couldn't decide, and they were going to do it at the last moment. You could argue that we were in fact the European laggards. For the longest time, at least in West German politics, your vote was determined by party membership, church membership, and union membership. And that's just no longer true. If any of you follow Adam Tooze's chart book, he made the point today that Germany is just simply a very diverse post-industrial society, but not a dysfunctional one. And that is indeed reflected in the sort of Germans bunching in the middle, but across 5 different parties, as Tom was just suggesting. The other thing that I think is really an important difference to American campaigns is 3 things. One, we can't gerrymander, not possible. You can't just sort of reconfigure electoral districts. Secondly, we have very strict campaign funding laws. Nothing like the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision, which unleashed, all these these super PACs on the landscape. And also we have trusted publicly funded media. I mean, unsurprisingly, the AfD spent a lot of political energy trying to undercut them, taking sort of Tory attacks against the BBC as its model, but it never really worked. And so those 3 things, I think, sort of make, despite, I think all of us were quite annoyed with much of this election campaign for its superficiality and the sort of, people chewing at each other's ankles, as it were. But on the whole, I thought yesterday's TV round with the party leaders and the candidates was remarkably civilized by American standards. Yeah. You know that Germans call that the Elefantenrunde, the elephant round, based on the fact that back in the old days, these were all older men. So you have to imagine sort of all these elephant bulls, standing there trumpeting and flapping their ears. Today it's a little more diverse and a bit younger, but people let each other talk. They didn't interrupt each other, and it was all fairly okay. And so were the trios, honestly.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Just picking up on what you were saying about the elephant round, the best known elephant round in recent years was the 2005 elephant round, when Merkel was facing off for the first time against Gerhard Schröder, and his rudeness in some way cost him the chance of forming a government. But 2005 was also interesting because it was the closest result to the current campaign, with the 2 leading parties neck and neck with each other, and with 3 possible coalition outcomes, given that Die Linke had made themselves unacceptable, that are exactly the same as the 3 coalition outcomes which are being faced today. So the question I'd like to ask Tom is, if you look back over the past 16 years, 3 of the 4 Merkel governments have been a grand coalition, and there's been a precedent previously in the 60s also for a coalition government, but no one at the moment is talking seriously about a continuation of the coalition government into 2022 and beyond. Why is that?
Well, frankly, because the last 8 years in particular of grand coalitions with the Union and the SPD have not been especially happy experiences for any of the participants. And basically what you ended up with was something like a very unhappy marriage where the partners decided to stay together for the sake of the children in this case being the German electorate. And now the children have grown up and they've realized that there are other parties and other possibilities available to them. And I don't think any of the principals currently involved in government would see retaining this current configuration as an option. Another extremely important factor, of course, is that were it to continue, the positions of the parties would be reversed. Olaf Scholz would be Chancellor and would be leading a coalition with the Union as junior partner. Talk to people in the Union and they do not see themselves as junior partners in a coalition with anybody, certainly not the Social Democrats. And then I just think just more broadly, there is a sense of change in the air. And the notion that after an election like this, you could just carry on for the third time in a row with the grand coalition, I just think is probably for the birds. There was a strong feeling of that 4 years ago, frankly, that it didn't make sense to continue with this. They only did it because they had to. I suppose you can't rule out the possibility that this time around something similar happens and that attempts to form either Jamaica or Traffic Light fall apart for whatever reason and we're left with a grand coalition. But I think that's highly unlikely and it would not be a good look, frankly.
Yeah. If one rules out the grand coalition, that leaves us with two options, both of which have the Free Democrats and the Greens as one of their components. So the Traffic Light with the SPD or the Jamaica coalition with the Union. One of those permutations, the Jamaica coalition, was attempted in 2017, but didn't work partly because the differences between the Greens and the FTB ended up being unbridgeable. Constanze, do you see things being different this time around? Is there a real chance of the FPD and the Greens making enough compromises to come into government together?
Well, last night this looked like it might become a bit of a thriller because the CDU and the SPD, the Conservatives and the Social Democrats, appeared to be in a dead heat. And Laschet last night said, absolutely, I claim the right to form a coalition. Now with what we call the vorläufiges amtliches Endergebnis, the preliminary official final results, that distance has become a little clearer at 24.1 for the CDU and 25.7 for the SPD. It's less obvious that Laschet gets to do that, but the fact remains that that it's not impossible on numerical terms, and that in coalitions building, negotiating, psychology is at least as important as the numbers. Now, I think in general, Laschet has sort of such a weak standing in his own party, and
sorry to interrupt you. Could we just, for the moment, focus on the FTB and the Greens? So I'd love to bring in the.
Absolutely. Okay, let me go back to the FDP and the Greens. The reason I was saying this is that because of the closeness of the result, the FDP and the Greens actually see themselves, both of them, as kingmakers. The difference being that the Liberals, I think, have a bizarrely, psychologically, a stronger claim to that than the Greens do. Because the Greens for such a long time thought they were going to be the potential winners of this election, fielding the first Green Chancellor, and had this sort of sugar rush of polls at 22% and more. So definitely in winning territory, and have come out at 14.8, which is a real disappointment to them. And what I think ought to be even more disappointing is that in the youth vote, there's a very distinct age division in the polls, with the above 35s clearly voting for Social Democrats or Conservatives, and those below voting Green or Liberal, but the Liberals actually edged out slightly ahead, which is a real blow for the Greens because they thought of themselves as the party of the future and of younger generations. And I'm, yeah, I mean, I'm sort of not quite sure yet how to read that. But I think that the Greens, you know, may have sort of coasted a little bit too much on their own sugar rush. And so Lindner is indeed in the interesting position of being a kingmaker. And his problem is that he had, like the Greens, by the way, thought he would, you know, he would be the man to make Jamaica happen this time around. And of course, the Conservatives are much closer to him and his sort of political program and his convictions than the Social Democrats are. Positions on fiscal policy, taxation, European debt issuance, all that is sort of obvious to do with the Conservatives and not with the Social Democrats. And then you add the personal element to that, which is that if I were Lindner, I would find it quite attractive as the sort of smallest member of a three-way coalition to have a rather weakened chancellor. Whereas if my chancellor is Olaf Scholz, who has actually been the finance minister, which is what I want to be now, the man who has every finance minister in the West and elsewhere on speed dial, and who can, if necessary, sort of call all of my new counterparts and say, forget what Christian Lindner is saying, call me if you've got anything, but you know, I'm the one who calls the shots here. That can't be attractive. And of course, the policy differences are significant. And so, I mean, Lindner, you know, has been carefully, you know, sort of not excluding either. But at this point, I find it hard to see how they would do Jamaica, simply because Laschet, I think, I sort of get the vague impression, but I'd really be curious to see what Tom hears there. But it sounds, again, I'm on the other side of the Atlantic, but it sounds like he and the CDU are doing a bit of an imploding job.
Yeah. In a moment, I'd like to drill down even further into the difference between traffic light and Jamaica. But if for the moment I could just ask a further question about this key question about whether the FDP and the Greens can ally with each other. I mean, clearly for the Greens, climate change has been their central theme. And during the campaign, Christian Lindner was at pains to say that he felt although the FDP acknowledged the importance of climate change, their approach to it was fundamentally different from the Greens, in that the Green approach, in his view, was based on culture, on national solutions and on state intervention, whereas the FDP approach is based on technology, international agreement and market forces. Tom, do you think that Christian Lindner's analysis is fair, and do you see the potential for the Greens and the FDP to agree on climate change?
I mean, there are obviously big differences between these parties, and they go way beyond the field of climate. In fact, some of the deepest differences are cultural. They can't stand each other, frankly. And you really get a sense of that when you go to their campaign events, not only from the speeches, but just from talking to the people there. All of that said, I think that a deal between these two parties, and that's interestingly, that's what we're now going to see, because they will be trying between themselves to come to terms before approaching either one of the bigger parties, I think is eminently doable. And I think the FDP, Christian Lindner in particular, in the run-up to the election, it was fascinating to watch him because he was very carefully laying out his red lines. The red lines are interesting, but what's also interesting is what doesn't count as a red line for the FDP. So take the area of climate, that will clearly be one of the most intense and interesting parts of the coalition negotiations to come. The Greens want a big debt-funded program of public investment on, expanding renewables, the electricity grid, charging stations for electric cars, so on and so forth. The FDP acknowledges the huge investment needs that Germany has. They want to largely mobilize private money. Of course, the Greens are not opposed to mobilizing private money. What the FDP doesn't want to do is to touch the constitutional debt brake, which has been there since 2009. The Greens would like to change that, but they also know very well it's not going to happen because you need a 2/3 majority in both houses of parliament to do so. So there are, without getting into the weeds too much, there are very clear ways in which you can come up with very clear ideas about how to satisfy both party's acknowledgement of Germany's need for public investment without crossing any of their red lines. In this case, it involves creating things like off-budget vehicles that could mobilize public money that could bring private money along in its wake. You can find similar workarounds on the red lines that the parties have on things like Europe's fiscal rules, on taxation policy. None of it will be easy, and both parties will need, or the leaders of both parties in negotiations will need, if only for kind of theatrical purposes, to demonstrate to their respective bases that they're having a very, very, very tough negotiation and they've taken it to the wire and so forth. But I don't think you should underestimate the hunger for power that exists in both of these parties. And I think that will be strong enough to ensure that they can get some sort of deal that they can then take to one of the bigger parties.
Yeah, that's great. I'd now like to dig a little bit more into each of the possible combinations, starting with the traffic light combination. Constanze, Olaf Scholz is not only the leader of the party that has come first in the elections, but during the election, the opinion polls were showing that he was by far the most popular choice of Chancellor for the German electorate. What do you think either of those factors will have any weight in the coalition negotiations? And if so, how would they be taken into account?
Well, again, as I was trying to imply earlier, I think the CDU might take care of this, problem by imploding quietly on its own, or sort of everybody sort of killing each other in the cardboard box, and then there's nothing left over. I think that's politically a distinct possibility the way it looks right now. There is just so much pent-up resentment of each other in that leadership group. Basically, if you'll forgive my saying this, men who've been stewing for 16 years, not having to be, been allowed anywhere near the trough of power. That I think that might, they might sort of blow each other up, and that would, leave Olaf Scholz with the, in the position of being the unquestioned, leader of negotiations. That said, Laschet really has been an unconvincing figure. And in other words, even if the blow up that I'm just envisaging doesn't happen, I think Laschet's weakness, have been sort of on display or throughout this campaign, and not just in that sort of unfortunate moment when he was seen laughing at the flood site behind the president's, giving a sort of grave speech. And at the same time, Annalena Baerbock, who's an attractive, very dynamic, very intelligent candidate, I think in sort of quite significant ways wasn't ready for prime time yet. And not just because of her lack of executive experience, but because she was thrown sideways by accusations over sort of, resume padding and sort of collaborating with a ghostwriter who wasn't, checking his sources, as it were. I do think that she got hammered for that in ways that other people wouldn't have, but she was thrown sideways by it. And I think that she will benefit from a term or so of executive experience, and then will be very much a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah.
So in other words, Scholz's attraction is partially a product of the weaknesses of his opponents. Yeah. But it also, he has had sort of scandals of his own, but they haven't, the Wirecard financial regulatory oversight scandal, Cum-Ex banking trading affair in Hamburg, and his failure to foresee the extraordinary sort of hard left riots at the G20 summit in Hamburg a few years ago. But these are, as other commentators sort of in a better place to judge than I am have said, they're sort of more indicative of his tendency to think that he has stuff under control than anything that would undermine his personal probity or his judgment. And the issues about regulatory and financial oversight in Germany are certainly systemic. They can't be pinned on one particular person. It was past time for them to get sorted. And I think they did try to do something about it when Wirecard blew up in their faces, although it also took them disgracefully long to come to terms with what was essentially staring them in the face. Yeah. I tried to pin the blame on the FT instead.
Just staying with Scholz for a moment, I mean, the SPD did center their whole campaign on his personality, but at the same time, he lost the campaign for SPD leadership in 2019 to two left-wing candidates, Norbert Lotte-Boyens and Saskia Esken, and there is a new force of left-leaning members of the Bundestag led by Kevin Kühnert, the deputy chairman. So my question to Tom would be, how far do you think that Scholz will be able to keep control of these coalition negotiations so that he could be potentially in a position to offer something to the FDP, or will the forces of his party drag him leftwards against his own will?
It's a funny thing to say, because we had all got used over the years to watching the SPD again and again and again melt down, usually in very public ways. And of course, for most of the period of the last parliament, they were in the doldrums, certainly in polling terms, sort of rattling on for months on end at about 15%, but they were also hemorrhaging money, hemorrhaging members. It was just a very miserable place. And it looked like they were basically suffering the fates of social democratic parties across Europe. So frankly, I don't think many of us saw this coming. And as Constanze said earlier, you know, Scholz to a large extent was lucky in his opponents. My personal view is that had Markus Söder led the Union, we'd be looking at a very different election result, but you know, that's speculation. But now, where are we now? Well, as you said, the campaign was centered very much on Olaf Scholz. So to the extent that this was a victory, this is very much Scholz's victory. And crucially, I think the Kevin Kühnerts and the Saskia Eskens and all the rest of them, they know that and they're behind him. Kevin Kühnert in particular has very much moderated his tone in the course of this campaign. He himself has now entered the Bundestag. You have behind the scenes, you have people like Lars Klingbeil, who's the Secretary General of the party, who has been a very kind of successful architect of this new internal harmony that you see. Now, let's not pretend that everybody is suddenly singing from the same hymn sheet. Of course, there are all sorts of different ideas around in policy terms, and also how coalition negotiations should work. And some of those may surface in the months ahead. But actually, I'm much more, as it were, bullish on SPD unity now than I've been basically at any time in the past, because I think the party has learned the habit of discipline, it's acquired the hunger for power, and it finds itself confronted with this extraordinary reality of leading the next government. And I think that in itself, rather as Merkel's ability to keep winning elections for the Union meant that a lot of her internal critics found themselves sidelined or silenced, I think to a certain extent you might see a similar dynamic play out inside the SPD as well.
One last question on the SPD before we move on to Jamaica and the CDU. During the election campaign, Christian Lindner was saying things like he wasn't prepared to send the country on a drift to the left, or he couldn't imagine an SPD offer that the FDP would be able to accept. Mir fehlt noch die Fantasie were his words. Constanze, do you see any possibility of the SPD being able to make a credible offer to the FDP, and if so, what would be the things that it would need to shift on in order to get the FDP's buy-in to a traffic light coalition? Well,
I mean, again, if the CDU implodes, you know, it'll be the only offer, and then the question is moot.
Yeah.
And I do think, I mean, again, you know, I'm on the other side of the Atlantic here. Tom's closer to this, but it sort of, I have a gut feeling that that is going to play a significant role, and that the CDU is not in the best psychological mood and position to sort of, you know, make a stabbing lunge for the leadership of coalition negotiations. It's just not, it just doesn't feel that way.
Yeah.
And so, and then again, you know, the liberals have half the votes of the Social Democrats. They may be kingmakers, but they're not that much of a kingmaker if the other alternative is, you know, crumbling.
Yeah.
And then it'll be the Social Democrats who are calling the shots, and the Liberals will sell negotiations as them putting a brake on the most, you know, floridly statist, public works publicly funded public works instincts of the Social Democrats, throwing money at all problems, right? And insisting on sort of, more libertarian answers to sort of digital technology challenges and that kind of thing. I think they will then sort of concentrate on getting the ministries that they want. And one of the expressions that has been notably floating around Berlin with regard to possible coalition negotiations is ministries with veto power. Which, as a trained constitutional lawyer, I'm not sure that that's really a thing. But what I think they mean is a ministry that is powerful enough to sort of put paid to stuff the chancellor is trying to do, if the party in possession of the ministry in question doesn't like that. Yeah. And that's why Lindner sort of, I think, is said to want finance, and it's why the Greens are said to want a sort of glorified ecological, climate, energy, economic ministry, which I think in their minds both would have sort of veto power. And again, you'd have to see how that plays out. Interestingly, foreign affairs and defense, the foreign ministries and the defense ministries play a subordinate role in these calculations, it appears, which I don't know whether that is good news to Europe's neighbors and to Germany's neighbors and allies or not, but it's notable. Yeah.
Let me pick up on what you were saying about the possibility of the CDU imploding. So if we look at Laschet's record, he was effectively shoehorned into the role of CDU chairman by the party establishment, although Friedrich Merz was the more popular candidate amongst the party base. He was pushed for the role of chancellor candidate again by the establishment, although Söder was, in many people's view, the candidate of the hearts, a bit like sort of the Princess Diana of Bavarian politics. And there are a number of people sort of sniffing
the people's prince.
Söder in particular has been criticised by Robert Habeck, the co-leader of the Greens, as making the 2017 coalition negotiations, him and Horst Seehofer, a shambles by continuing to interfere with the CDU's position. So, Tom, do you agree with Constanze that there is this risk of the union imploding in some way and therefore being unable to continue that hope of putting forward sensible coalition negotiations?
Yes, I do. It's just the feeling today in Berlin, watching the way that the day has unfolded. There is a real sense that the walls are closing in on Armin Laschet now. You have people inside his own party. CSU MP earlier today said the union is brain dead. Another senior CDU politician said that they need to forget about the idea of forming a next government. And even, falling short of sort of demands for resignation, no one in the party is coming out and saying, we now have a strong mandate to try to lead the next government. The best that we can do is to make some sort of offer and hope that they'll listen to us. It's visibly been a disaster for the union, by far their worst election result in history. This is visibly the result, in part at least, of the candidate that they chose, who's had an absolute shocker. And I just really now, actually, just sort of watching the way that things have unfolded today, the idea that we could end up with a coalition led by the union with Armin Laschet as chancellor, which basically means a Jamaica coalition, I actually find it almost unthinkable, and it would feel like such a kind of admission of failure. It would feel so sort of tired, almost eccentric, that with everything that's happened, with this terrible election result for the union, with the extraordinary difference in popularity for the two candidates, Scholz, orders of magnitude more popular than Armin Laschet, the idea that somehow these things could be overcome and you could put together a Jamaican coalition is now starting to feel like it's one for the birds. Interestingly, if that's right, or more importantly, if that assessment is shared by the people who are about to begin negotiating the coalition, that changes the the relationship between those negotiators. It basically puts Olaf Scholz in a much stronger position, because if the FDP and the Greens no longer have a meaningful, credible alternative, if they can no longer say to Olaf Scholz, this is no good, we're going to go off and talk to Mr. Laschet, they have nowhere else to go. And that puts Olaf Scholz in a much stronger position when he is attempting to put that government together. I think that may be how things start to shake out now.
Yeah, that's great. Let's move on to...
Can I just make one point?
Please.
This whole sort of People's Prince thing is really dangerous. I hope nobody from the CSU is listening to us, because Marcus Söder, as we know, has a tendency to get dressed up in sort of varieties of highly dodgy carnival wear. And we should not put it past him to dress up as Lady Diana in next February. So, watch it.
That's true. He did Shrek. He did Marilyn Monroe. So yeah.
Oh God.
Good point.
Cleared on my mind.
Let's come on to a few policy issues, which may be an implication of the next government. So, Constanze, you mentioned briefly that no one had been talking much about foreign and security policy. From an American perspective, do you think that the fact that the next German Chancellor will be much less well known and less well experienced than Merkel will make a difference to the German-US relationship, or will the American leaders treat the next German Chancellor as de facto the sort of leading politician in Europe just because
he's German?
Is the German Chancellor?
Well, I think a lot depends on just how extended these coalition negotiations will be. And let's keep in mind firmly, or they should keep in mind firmly, that we have the G7 presidency from January. And it would really be quite nice, and I think much appreciated by our allies, if we didn't negotiate into the G7 presidency, which would, by inference mean that Angela Merkel would still be presiding over it because she'd be the head of the caretaker government while everybody else is negotiating. I don't think we can afford such solipsism. I think our partners would find that astounding. That said, if what Tom and I have just been saying is correct, then it ought not to take that long. Yeah. They ought to get themselves sorted. Although I will say that I was quite impressed by how prepared the Biden administration was when it came in, and I knew from many of my friends here that they had been participating in working groups, writing papers, and the team that came in, pulled these papers out of its, out of its boxes and set to work at a sort of really quite impressive clip. And I have some doubt, based on what I've read in the party programs, particularly in the foreign and security policy chapters, that they are prepared in the same way. And that is not least because if we're taking as our baseline a traffic light coalition, then I have to tell you that the only ones who really sort of have it sorted out are the Liberals. Yeah. Because the Green Party program is sort of a Jesuitical grab back of everything to, we want to be everything to all members. Which essentially meant that nobody quite had the courage and the energy to sort of pound any coherence into the program. And it is notably equivocal about things that allies would care about, like nuclear participation and certain forms, and the defense spending. And whereas I have to say the Social Democratic chapter, I only read last week, and I have to say, I was just appalled and mystified. I'd really like to sort of, at some point, talk to the person or persons who wrote this, because it's the Europe chapter of the Social Democratic program, which is only about 62 pages long, is at the end, and it has a subheader, Europe and the neighborhood. And the transatlantic relationship, Russia and China, are all discussed under the subheader, Europe and the neighborhood. Which is mystifying to me as a German, and if that's the case, to anybody else reading this must be just wondering whether they have their heads screwed on straight. I mean that, and knowing, and the other thing is, of course, as Tom knows very well, the Social Democrats have had vicious internal disagreements about foreign and security policy, and they have had, in the person of their parliamentary leader, Rolf Mützenich, someone who represents the sort of left-wing view, and is, you know, has a sort of arms control and disarmament sort of mindset that appears to want to take social democratic foreign policy firmly back to the 1980s, which, you know, overall is very much the sound of that chapter of the SPD program. Yeah. And he's also, I think, managed to, shall we say, lose the three parliamentarians in the SPD who were most knowledgeable about foreign and defense policy. Johannes Kahrs, defense budget expert, definitely acknowledged as a budget expert. Then Hans-Peter Bartels, the defense ombudsman, also extremely knowledgeable about the armed forces. And finally, Fritz Felgentreu, who was, you know, I think everybody's favorite among the SPD foreign policy people, next to Neil Schmid, as somebody who was both knowledgeable, deeply versed, and somebody, you know, who's highly collegial and probably, you know, and sort of multilingual, and somebody who could send beyond the borders of Germany without being embarrassed. Yeah. And so I have, as they say in America, I have concerns.
Tom, please feel free to comment on what Constanze just said, but I'd just like to add in one more question, which is, I suspect, of particular interest to our members and listeners. So in the past few months, there's been a certain amount of détente, both between the UK and the EU and between the UK and Germany. So we've had the agreement on the trade and policy cooperation. We've had the joint foreign policy cooperation agreement between UK and Germany. We've had the agreement that the two cabinets will meet on an annual basis. Do you see the relationship between the UK and Germany likely to be becoming closer or more distant under the new government than under the last one?
I think for so long as Brexit and its consequences remain a running sore in the UK-EU relationship, as it continues to be with the dispute over the Northern Irish Protocol, then any efforts that that sort of like-minded souls on either the German or the British side might make to effect a meaningful sort of détente, and, you know, with all due respect to the people who've put together the various things that you've spoken about, I don't really think they amount to much more than a hill of beans at this stage. Until then, unless that can be figured out, then I don't really think we're going to see a significant improvement in that bilateral relationship. The Brits would certainly like there to be such a thing, and they have made efforts to ensure that there can be such a thing. And there are some structures in which Britain and Germany work together, such as the E3 put together originally to implement the Iranian nuclear deal, which has since extended its work into other fields. You know, these things do potentially matter, and they don't need to be held hostage to Brexit. But for the most part, Germany is not interested in having Britain work around the Brexit problems to strengthen its bilateral relationship. And so I think that's going to remain a running sore. And I think there's a particular bafflement in Germany in the kind of foreign policy decision-making elites as to why this British government has essentially ruled out the possibility not only of having a deep trading relationship. I think people here have slowly come to understand that that is to a certain extent what Brexit was about. But why it is that the British government has ruled out any sort of deep and comprehensive foreign policy and security relationship with the EU. I think the Germans will say, well, we didn't see anybody in the run-up to Brexit complaining that Britain was locked too closely into European defence efforts or diplomatic efforts, sort of nugatory as they were. And yet the British government has decided that this is not something that they want to pursue at all. So I think there's a strong sense here that while this government is in place, and particularly while Boris Johnson is in place, that relationship is not really going to go anywhere, particularly while you have this running sore of the Northern Irish issue.
Yeah, I'd like to bring in Antonia to start asking questions from the audience, but just one last question to both, which I think I know the answer to, is what is your best guess at the moment as to who the next Chancellor will be, in what coalition, and when the next government will be agreed? Constanze, starting with you.
Well, I think it's going to be Scholz and traffic light, and I think they ought to be done by December by rights. I do think there's enough ideological difference for them to have to thrash out some things for over 2 months. I think that is what it's going to take. But I think they all know they need to be done before the German G7 presidency begins. Otherwise, we'll be a laughing stock.
Yeah, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. It is uncertain. And as I said before, I think all sides will need to demonstrate to their base for theatrical purposes that they've been fighting very, very hard over the things that they really believe in. But particularly if Jamaica just genuinely starts to look like it's not a viable alternative and that there is no real alternative to traffic light, there's nothing to stop them just getting the hell on with it. Scholz has already said they ought to try to have something in place by the end of the year. So that's what hopefully they will try to do.
Yeah. Antonia, over to you.
Thank you. Just before I start, I want to take a quick screenshot. Peter, if you just stay on for that very quickly, and then we can go on to questions. Brilliant, thank you. So the first question, which is actually two questions, is from Anne Dighton. So the first question is, would you like to elaborate on the very different polling in the former Eastern Germany, with party extremes more represented and less movement to the centre? And her second question is, behind all this is the constitutional and federal structure of Germany. In the UK, this structure is often seen as giving rise to more measured and slower policy making, both in domestic and foreign policy. What would be your views on this, and how does this square with Germany's place in the EU/world and demands for a more activist policy?
Tom, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think Constanze should definitely answer the second question. I'll have a go at the first on the East. I don't quite agree with the way that it was presented, but it's a complicated picture. The AfD, if you look at a map of where constituencies were won, you find this kind of streak of AfD blue across Saxony and large parts of Thuringia, not so much in the kind of northern part of Eastern Germany. But what's happened here isn't so much that the AfD has had a wonderful election result. It didn't really do that much better even in these parts of Germany than it did in 2017. What happened is that the CDU collapsed and that you had less of an alternative. Die Linke, which has a strong, which traces its ancestry in part to the old East German Communist Party, I think is in serious trouble and is probably facing extinction, in large part because it has a significant part of its voter base is elderly voters in East Germany who, to put it bluntly, are dying out. The kind of protest vote in some of those parts of East Germany for younger voters has shifted towards the AfD. It's not really obvious anymore what the proposition, the distinct proposition that Die Linke has to the German electorate, and we saw it fell below the 5% threshold, as you said in your introduction, only made it into parliament because of the 3 direct mandates. It may not make it into parliament in the future. So yes, the East is different. That matters, I think, for state elections more than it does for the federal one. And I know that lots of people in Saxony are alarmed to see the AfD now, by a distance, at least in this federal election, being the leading force there. It is something to worry about. And we've seen the difficulty that some East German states have in putting together state governments. They have to assemble these very weird, unwieldy coalitions in order to keep the extremes out. That will be a big problem going forward. But in this federal election, I don't really think it's a major part of the story.
Yeah, I agree with you, Tom, that showing is a result of the weakness of the CDU and Die Linke. But it's concerning in that if you look at the support for Die Linke and the AfD on the map of Germany, it firmly traces the old inner German border. And that's distressing because it's now more than 30 years since reunification. And I think, you know, it does sort of behoove the entirety of the country to think long and hard about what went wrong there. It's beyond time. And while I'm not suggesting, you know, that economic and social policy are completely to blame for this, or the sort of the politics of the mainstream parties, I do think that you know, there is a fairly clear correlation between AfD votership and the sort of, you know, deindustrialized, you know, basically left behind rural regions of Eastern Germany who I think have some cause to feel overlooked. Again, that's not in any way to minimize the sort of cultural aspects of this, and to the degree that the AfD has so visibly radicalized and affiliated itself with neo-Nazi movements and identitarians, it's truly concerning that they would find, that they would still capture 10% of the nationwide vote. And the other thing that's concerning about the AfD, while we're at it, is that now that it, under German political foundation funding rules, with 2 terms in parliament, the AfD can now claim public money funding for its political foundations, and that will help it in doing what I think it's done most successfully and stealthily, which is to sort of create, as it were, countercultural institutions to feed its narratives and to sort of cordon off the bubbles in which its supporters live. And that, I think, is another concern that we ought to have, particularly since the AfD has also visibly made inroads, not just into the armed forces and to the police, but also into the courts. Now, on federalism and foreign and security policy, I'm not sure that there is a direct connection, except to the extent that, I mean, it's not direct as in monocausal. What there is, I think, is that the sort of foreign and security policy tribe, which used to be sort of the nuclear wallahs and the armed forces wallahs, who were in the sort of glorious West German political traditions, usually left to their own devices without anybody ever questioning them. That's no longer possible, because it's become clear that the effectiveness and the credibility of domestic governments is a precondition for a state's ability to make foreign security policy, and not just in Germany, all through the West. And so there have been, one of the more interesting new developments that not a lot of people have written about are how many of the parties have given serious thought to centralizing security and foreign policy decision-making in the form, for example, of a National Security Council in the Chancery, or for there to be a national security strategy, to be drafted every year and then defended in Parliament. That's something the Americans have and others have, and we don't. And I think that the CDU and the Liberals, I think both have that in their party programs. I think the Liberals and the Greens are much more resistant to that kind of thing. But we'll see how that goes. I mean, there is a sense, there is a sense, I think, in the strategic community that with national security issues being ever diffused across ministries, arguably in the pandemic, we've learned that medical supply chains are a matter of national security. And that if you apply the sort of very decentralizing rules of political decision-making in Berlin to that, then you have real problems. And so I think that even with a government that is less inclined than a Jamaica government would be to centralize, the question will be forced on them.
Okay, and then we have another question here from Chris Adams. Which combination does President Macron wish? I'm assuming he's talking about the coalition. Maybe Tom, I can pass over to you.
I think Macron would like to have a Jamaica coalition on foreign and security policy and a traffic light coalition on economic and fiscal policy. So that's not a very helpful answer. But the FDP and were Christian Lindner to capture the finance ministry in a traffic light coalition, which I think is highly likely. I think he would delight in acting as a spoiler in the Eurogroup and in ECOFIN on matters like reforming the EU's fiscal rules, which is a debate that's coming up imminently, on completing European and Monetary Union, Banking Union, Capital Markets Union, and in the longer term, the future of the Recovery Fund and the question of whether the EU can have meaningful permanent fiscal capacity. Constanze has already spoken about some of the curious ideas that you find in some parts of the SPD on foreign and security policy. I mean, I've spoken to French officials who are endlessly frustrated with what they consider to be the attempts of some parts of the Social Democrat Society, the current Grand Coalition, to put a brake on meaningful common European defence projects, joint armaments, export rules, and the rest of it. And I think that there will probably be some concerns in Paris that those sorts of problems will only worsen if you have the SPD leading the next government. So I'm guessing, you know, if Paris is looking at developments in Germany and wondering which way they would like things to go, there's probably a feeling of strong ambivalence at the moment.
Thank you. And the next question here is from Paul Lever. The next German Chancellor will represent a party with only 25% of the vote and will have to share power with 2 other parties. He will not have the domestic authority of his predecessors. How much will this affect Germany's international influence? Perhaps I can hand over to Constanze.
Honestly, you know, it's not as though anybody had a choice, right? I mean, it's not as though Boris Johnson gets to say, you know, I'm not going to talk to anybody who doesn't have, you know, more than 26%. You deal with the hand that you've got. And I think that I would suspect that number 10 has some respect for Olaf Scholz's tenure as finance minister. And I mean, maybe number 10 is somewhat less enamored of this than others might be, but just to add on to the question about Macron, Olaf Scholz and his team at the finance ministry, I think, earned a place in the history books by pushing through the German assent to the European recovery program and forcing the CDU and Merkel to get on board in the pandemic. And I think without that, the European project could quite well have taken a very serious hit. And so that's a fairly significant achievement. People know him and know the people who advise him, and they're a serious lot. And a lot of the issues that we're going to have to deal with in the near future are of a macroeconomic and fiscal policy nature. And I think it ought to be deemed useful by Scholz's counterparts that he has such significant experience in this. Right, Tom?
Absolutely. And you can, not only on the recovery fund, I mean, I completely agree, Scholz was central to that. I mean, of course, you had to get Merkel and the CDU to go along with it, and they did, and that was important. But the role that the finance ministry played was absolutely central. And you can add to that a real feather in Scholz's cap, which is helping put together this deal early this year on minimum global corporate taxation rates. He'd been working on that for years, and it worked. That wasn't a done deal that was going to happen. So, you know, I mean, his experience, he's a very experienced politician. He doesn't obviously have extensive experience at the international level, but he also doesn't have no experience. And these two things, I think, this global tax deal and Next Generation EU, the pandemic recovery fund, these are serious achievements and the sort of thing that Scholz and his advisors will, should they form a government, will carry into the Chancellery with them, and that Germany's partners will be very aware of.
Absolutely. No, and in that sense, he's definitely not just serious, but heavyweight.
I think we have time for one last question. This one is from Claudia Hamel. How far did Angela Merkel's approach to supporting her party affect the outcome?
I mean, Angela Merkel wanted to do everything she possibly could to stay the hell out of this election campaign. She made that very, very clear as it began. And unfortunately, because the party had such a disastrous campaign, she got sucked into it. And she gave speeches in the Bundestag warning that Scholz was going to lead the country into penury led by Scholz at the head of a left-wing government. In the last couple of weeks, she's been campaigning personally with Armin Laschet. She invited him, in fact, to her constituency a few days ago on the Baltic Sea coast. And unfortunately, they were met both with pelting rain and a yelping anti-vax mob. So that didn't go down very well. You know, she needed to, one of the funny things I found about this is that when Angela Merkel started to take a kind of more partisan role in this campaign, a lot of Germans seemed sort of shocked that Angela Merkel, their chancellor, was a partisan politician who belonged to one party and not another, and wanted that party to win an election and not the other party. And for me, that's such a strong sign of how Merkel had sort of risen above politics to become almost like a kind of monarch rather than a partisan politician occupying a partisan a partisan position as Chancellor. So, you know, it made the Union staged a very modest comeback in the last week or two of the campaign. Possibly that had something to do with the fact that Merkel got involved. She remains very popular. She'll leave office with an approval rating of more than 80%, but it certainly wasn't decisive one way or the other.
Yes, unfortunately, that concludes our talk. We're now at the end of our time, and I just want to say thank you very, very much again to our brilliant panelists, Constanze Stelzenmüller and Tom Nuttall, for joining us this evening and for sharing such important insights into what is undoubtedly a very exciting election. Thanks also to everyone in the audience for joining us tonight and for asking your questions. The BGA has a whole range of events coming up this autumn, 2 of which will already be taking place next week. On Wednesday, we'll be hosting a talk by Professor Tiffany Florville on her new book, Mobilizing Black Germany. And on Thursday, we'll be hosting our traditional Oktoberfest at Steins in London. You can already book tickets for the Oktoberfest, and registration will be open soon for our event with Professor Florville. So once again, thank you very, very much. And I hope you all have a good evening.
And thank you very much
for the invitation.
Thank you.
Cheers. Good to see you, Tom.
Happy Oktoberfest.